My name is Dr. Beth Cooper Benjamin. I am so pleased to welcome you to today's program, the conversation with the winner of the 2025 Ilia Salita Excellence in Research Award, Dr. Keren Fraiman. It could not be more timely for us to join together for this conversation, and we're so grateful to have Dr. Fraiman here in conversation with Rabbi Elka Abrahamson. I'm going to introduce them both momentarily. I just want to say up front that Keren's research was cited by the selection committee this year, both in terms of the relevance of her study, especially in its prescience, and that it was published before October 7th, but clearly has profound implications for the world that we are inhabiting and that educators are navigating now. And also, really because of her thoughtful analysis of a difficult communal problem and its accessibility and its rigor. Accessibility and rigor are not qualities that always go hand in hand in research, and that is really a part of the exceptional quality of this project, and also I think something that really lends itself to a discussion that we are very pleased to bring you today that is open to foundation professionals, to funders, and to the broader community. We know that there are educators and nonprofit folks and folks from various parts of the community who are interested in this work and in this conversation. And we're very grateful to be able to bring the discussion to everyone here. We do invite you to add your questions for the panelists into the chat. The chat is open for everyone. If you are comfortable sharing them where they are visible to everyone. If you are more comfortable sharing your questions directly with the panelists, with our speakers, you can also do that through the Q&A function, which you'll also find at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I am going to introduce our panelists for today. So our recipient of the 2025 Ilia Salita Excellence in Research Award, Dr. Keren Fraiman. Keren is the Dean and Chief Academic Officer at the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership. And she is also, Elka wanted me to be sure to mention, Keren is also a Wexner Field Fellow. So Keren, thank you so much for joining us today. And she is joined in conversation by Rabbi Elka Abrahamson, who is president of the Wexner Foundation. And I am so happy to turn the conversation over to the two of you.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to use first names. So thank you, Beth. Thank you to JFN. And of course, thank you to Keren. I just want to take a few seconds to honor my colleague Ilia's memory and name how unbelievably proud he would be of this research. And more than that, how much he would add to this conversation and how much we miss his voice in these rigorous challenges of our people. And he was just a great colleague and friend. So Keren, your work really speaks to his passions. And I want to ask you right off, what brought you to the work and to this research? Where did this come from in you?
Thanks, Elka. And thanks everyone for being here. And thank you to JFN for hosting this conversation for the award. This story is really personal for me. You know, my background's in international security and Middle East politics, and I spent most of my doctoral research studying terrorism and coercion in the Middle East. But I remember vividly in 2014, I was driving back home from the Lincoln Park Zoo camp with my son, who had his 18th birthday last Thursday. And he was 7 years old at the time. And we were driving back on a sunny day. And he said to me, "Mom, I have a question." And I said, "Gotti, what's up?" And he said, "Mom, why did the Israelis kill 4 boys on the beach?" And so, like any good mom, I said, "Gotti, do you want ice cream?" And we pulled over to an ice cream shop, Lickety Splits, a local shop, and we had our very first conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was 7. I didn't expect it. He had been tuning into the story that had happened on NPR that day. And even though I had a background in international security, I'd been following the war, this was my area of expertise, I realized in that moment that I was holding his Jewish identity, his relationship to Israel in my hand. He actually doesn't remember this conversation. I told him that at his bar mitzvah, because for us, it's a Tuesday, right? Like in our home, these are conversations that we have every day. But I realized in that moment just how difficult these conversations are and how quickly they enter into their minds. He was 7. I'll just fast forward the story because obviously he's now 18. He has a younger brother, Noam, who is 9 right now. But at the start of October 7th, right after October 7th, we were sitting at the breakfast bar in my home. I had planned to go to Israel in November of 2023. And my daughter, who was 12 at the time, was very upset that I was going to Israel. She was extremely scared and fearful. It was the first time she had mentioned anything about October 7th. She knew that it had happened. She attends a Jewish day school, and she was very upset. And she said to me, "Mom, I'm going to hide all your clothes and all the suitcases. You cannot go to Israel." And so Noam, he was 7, he said, "Mom, but Denis, where Mom is going, it's safe. She's not going to the South." And Denis says, "Well, you wouldn't go to Ukraine." And Gotti, my eldest, then says, "Well, Ukraine is more of an all-out war. All of the major cities have been impacted. It's hard to get resources. That's not how it is in Tel Aviv, where Mom will be." And Noam says, "And anyways, Ukraine is a small country." To which I said, "Dear Chicago Jewish Day School, please focus on geography." But it sort of made me realize that as young as 7, and that's what the research suggests, these conversations are coming home, and they're not the conversations we want to have, but they're essential. And I think it would really force me to think about how do we bring them into our Jewish settings.
I'm going to add a story and turn that into a question as well. I know that everyone who's on this webinar probably has a similar story. Mine is from another generation because it relates to my 8-year-old grandson and the generation between my children who had the privilege of all of the things, day school, summer camp, Israel trips. And at a certain point in their early adulthood sort of said, "Wait a minute, I'm not sure you," speaking to all of us, "told me X, Y, and Z. How is it possible that with all that I was given, I don't know everything? I don't know dual narratives. I don't know the nature of the conflict." And then on Yom Ha'atzmaut, our 8-year-old grandson uh, in Chicago came home from celebrating, and the conversation simmered to the top in our family conversations about at what point will he know what the map of Israel really looks like? Like, what does it say that I never knew where one of my children, adult children, I never knew where Gaza was till I was in my, late teens. And we all know that maps are political, that maps of Israel are particularly political. And it's a hard conversation, which you really get to in your research. We want to teach love. We want to teach and embrace. We want to teach all the things that bolster our Jewish identity and are serious, like Ahavat Yisrael, our love of Israel. And we wrestle with how does your research help us understand that bridge from love to deeper understanding to knowledge, to conflict education. So help us, answer the question of when do you do this and what keeps us from doing it? And I also want you to address why you believe teaching the conflict early actually bolsters love and doesn't detract from it. So that's a lot, but I think that's what we're all trying to unpack in our own souls.
Great. I'll start with the first one, and you'll keep me honest to bring me back if I skip over. I think what I loved about your question is that you said, how do we bridge from love to, the real maps to the conflict? Because I think sometimes we juxtapose these against each other. We think it's either love or it's the real story. And at least in my world or in my life, like true love includes the real story, and it's not in opposition to, it's actually part of the love that we have. It includes the complexity. And I think sometimes the idea of engaging with this has seemed in opposition to Ahavat Israel. But I was born in Israel. I served in the IDF. My conversations are not in opposition to Ahavat Israel. They come from a deep love and commitment to Israel, right? And that, by the way, I think that's true in other political relationships that I have, in other personal relationships that I have, that my commitment to them, it's actually the care that I have for them that encourages me or bolsters me to be engaged in the real story. And so I think when I start to think about how do we bridge this story, I think the research shows that whether we like it or not, we're not opening a Pandora's box. By age 7, when kids can read, when they see the paper that landed on our doorstep, when they are sitting in a restaurant where CNN is scrolling, and in fact, Sivan Zakai highlights this, and she's a past Ilia Salita Award winner, in her research that by age 7, kids are aware that there is a conflict in Israel. And so the question is, when we don't share it with them, to me, the risk is that we're not sharing the whole story. And it's not that they're not aware. I think there was a time we thought, oh, we don't want to open the Pandora's box. Well, the Pandora's box is there. And part of our opportunity, or maybe the missed opportunity, is that we're not contextualizing it within Ahavat Israel. Our settings give us the opportunity to talk about those things that maybe we don't talk about or we haven't talked about in the past within the context of a broader story, a broader relationship, a deep love, a deep caring. And by the way, I think this thing of not seeing maps, it extends into graduate school. I teach graduate students, Jewish communal professionals, who have never really seen the map of Israel, who really have never understood what the Green Line is and what's the West Bank and what do we mean by the different areas, or wait, what's happening in Gaza? And it might be, they might know where it's situated on a map, but not necessarily what the implications of its placement and some of this past October 7th, I think came, all the force them to start to begin to understand or try to understand, well, what happened in 2006 and what happened before then. And I think these conversations in graduate school are a little late, right? Because Israel's showing up in every aspect.
I think so.
A little late, or just like a little late to the party.
We can agree.
But I think that there's an assumption of fragility, which I guess part of what my research is trying to challenge is that I think deep relationships should be strong and resilient. And I think our people are resilient. And this relationship, if we want it to be enduring, needs to be sufficiently resilient to handle the realities of what is. Sometimes, by the way, when I talk to parents, they're worried about students getting to college and hearing all the lies about Israel. And I say to them, there's a problem with the lies, but I'm more worried about the truths, right? I'm worried that if the first time that they've encountered the Palestinian narrative is within a Middle East politics course that is not concerned with their Jewish identity or their relationship to Israel, we've missed the opportunity to have them reckon with that earlier. And it's complicated, it's nuanced, it's challenging. There are parts that, are hard to talk about, but they're essentially they are a real part of the story. So that's part one, which is, I think when we don't see it as opposition, then we see it. And by the way, maps are a great tool to start early, because maps, while political, help us to say who lives where. And that's actually just that story, right? Of like who lives where and who are the people that live within Israel and what are their identities. That's not about the big C conflict, but it's a really important part of the story that I think even that part is neglected. Like understanding that we can say Palestinians when they're 7. It's okay. Like it's okay. So that was part one. Part two had to do with what gets in the way, right?
Yeah, so maybe you can go ahead and, because Karen, when you talk about it, it seems so, I don't want to say easy, but it seems so reasonable. Like, of course we should all be doing this. And, the word nuance has probably come up more about Israel in the last, few years than any other word we have to have nuance. But it's hard to identify what keeps us from being nuanced. And that's what your research really tried to pin down. So if you could just briefly give those categories of what keeps us from going there, and then we can talk more about implications.
Terrific. So I'll start by saying that typically when educators, not just in Jewish settings, are reticent to engage with something, the usual answer is that they don't think it's important. What's interesting about this research is that all of the educators that I spoke about articulated and could articulate very eloquently why dealing with the conflict was important. And so in a certain way, the conventional wisdom already was sort of taken off the table. But it revealed 4 categories of reticence that are related, but actually very distinct. The first one is, I don't know enough. And I want to just highlight the people that I did my research with are what I would call upper right quadrant educators, the most educated, most motivated, most prepared, all had enrolled in graduate programs about Israel or about, Jewish education or rabbinic programs. So all had graduate courses on Israel, all had participated in the iFellows Master's Concentration in Israel Education, all had been in Israel beyond a birthright trip. So are most ready, are most invested in, if you will. And so the first one, they said, I don't know enough. Now, given that they had been in courses, I tried to probe a little bit more. And what was revealed is, one is that they don't necessarily know how to relate current events to the things that they learned about in class. In some cases, they don't know what to think themselves, so they have a hard time bringing it to their learners. And they're not sure what their learners need to know to engage with this complicated and nuanced space, especially in educational settings that have strained times around Israel education. The second one was around, I don't know how to manage difficult conversations. And here it's really about the pedagogy of difficult conversations. They worried about conversations that would spiral out of control, that they didn't have the tools to either both raise the heat or lower the heat in these conversations in a certain way, how to get them into the adaptive space. The third one was around the emotions of the conflict. And this one was incredibly interesting because it was bifurcated. There were some educators who talked about the love that you spoke about. I thought my job was to help them love Israel. If I share hard things, will it diminish their love? On the one hand. And the other was, I know that many of my learners are coming in angry, scared, frustrated, and those emotions I also don't know how to deal with. And all of the educators listed some version of the first 3, but all the educators listed the last typology, which was around the system. And this in shorthand is, who will have my back when I get that phone call? Both about institutional support and communal pressures. And all of them had stories about being censured, about not really having clear boundaries about what the conversation that they can have, not feeling that when they got that phone call, they would be supported. And in many cases had either stories of people that they knew or people that they had heard of who had even lost their jobs over sort of crossing some lines or engaging with the conflict in a way that wasn't supported within their institution. And that one is the one that is outside of training. And it's also a condition that they don't control, right? It's sort of beyond.
Right. I really want to talk about the system. And just wondering, no matter how effective we are with the first 3, with knowing, with pedagogy, and with emotions, and we have the right faculty, the right teachers in the room, if the parent population around that institution is, look, I don't send my kid here to get anything but love Israel, kind of Israel right or wrong, stand with Israel, aren't we in a constant like push against the system? Or do we have, and here I say, God forbid, are we heading toward a system that just bifurcates and says, if you want, conflict education, you're going to attend this school. If you want, other kinds of, agreement without the conflict education. I don't know what the opposite of conflict education is.
Awful. I don't know,
Then you attend that school, and maybe that's fine. I'm just thinking of, and I speak, very honestly and personally, and in my professional life, as someone who works with many young professionals, some have lost their jobs for very, I would say, petty, and I use that word advisedly, like, petty infractions that pushed against the system unknowingly. And it's just easier not to go there if you're trying to preserve your position. So how does the system hold up when, if it get concentric circles built out, there's a lot of pressure on the system? And
Well, I
that's a
think
hard
there's
question.
Yeah, no, I guess I'll try to break it up a little bit, which is to say, I think that sentiment is exactly the sentiment that we're seeing. By the way, my research was on educators, but I know that there's similar work being done on rabbis that, there are people that sort of look at how many rabbis are saying Israel in their sermons at all, right? Because it seems to be not spoken about. And so I think these pressures are real. And in many cases, I think the answer is, this is not the hill I want to die on, right? Like this is not my
exactly.
only goal. Right. So I have a lot of good that I can bring to the educational space. Is it worthwhile? So I think that pressure is extremely real. The thing that is interesting about the system is that it's not a unified system. I think there are pressures on the I love Israel, and there's the pressures on, there's right and left pressures, there's up and down pressures, there's pressures that come from board members and parents. And I wish to say that every school was so sort of transparent in their approach that we would know what the boundaries are, but a lot, actually, that's what they were looking for. Tell me what the boundaries are. Tell me what I can speak about and what I can't speak about. And I think many educationalists, it's, you know, as Diana Bloom, one of my favorite gurus, says, clarity is kindness. And I think in this space, being able to articulate what our values are and what the boundaries are for educators is one of the tools for giving support. Now, in some cases, that might be a very narrow space, and it may create this kind of bifurcated system. But I don't necessarily think that it's the case that schools are united, right? So sometimes educators would talk about parents that were complaining on one side and then the other side, right? And so it's not that that the school community or the parent community is unified. And in a certain way, I think one of the recommendations of my research is not to create consensus about politics or the opinion. Often, by the way, when I teach, no one knows my politics by the end, and because I push back, I try to keep it a bit mysterious. But what we need consensus on is that these conversations are valuable, even when they're messy, even when they expose opinions we completely disagree about, even when we're extremely uncomfortable. And I think this comfort with discomfort is one of the things that is not just missing in this space, it's missing in our polarized society. We want a feed that reinforces our own opinions. We want to be in spaces where we all agree. We don't like to argue, even though I think there's lots of, at least not face to face. And I think it's the consensus should be around comfort and discomfort, right? And the importance of the conversation. Now, it's not easy, right? Because there are these concentric circles of non-unified pressures.
Let's stay with the school setting for a second. I think you're talking about bringing us to productive discomfort rather than, destabilizing discomfort.
Right.
How can teacher training build up a system that can hold productive discomfort without imploding?
Teacher training or systems training?
Well, let's start with teacher training, because I do think I'm just thinking while you're talking, there are probably some trust issues around teachers. As much as we trust those teachers doing math or doing, the Siddur or Parshat HaShavua, I'm not sure I want you teaching my kid Israeli politics, because that's going to kind of happen in the house around the kitchen table, right? So how do we navigate that first with faculty or take the system, either one?
I'll take both. I think
Doctor's choice.
All right. So I'll start with, I guess, the teachers, which one is, I think these are difficult things, but they're not insurmountable. And I think that that's a really important sort of, I want to underline that, right? Which is to say, I often will say slightly flippantly, but I don't think it's actually untrue, that give me 3 weeks in a summer institute with educators and I will get them over the hump. Like, I will get them sufficiently trained. Now, it doesn't mean they know everything. They're not going to become Middle East scholars, but I think you can identify what are the recurring concepts that keep coming.
So sufficiently trained on the material itself, rather
on
than
the material and on the pedagogy and on the emotions.
and holding the conflict comfortably.
Exactly. And I think, because I think that, when in 2014, when I was working at the Ice Center on the conflict education, we had a group of, I think it was 8 PhDs, and we asked the question, like, what's new in the 2014 Gaza conflict that hadn't happened before? And we could come up with nothing, like literally nothing, because these questions around the conflict are cyclical, they're recurring, they have new faces, but they are fundamentally at their core around similar things. Now, our educators don't need to be CNN reporters. They don't need to be diplomats. They don't need to resolve the conflict. They need to have some basic frameworks that can transfer into things that are occurring today. And I think many of the questions that come from kids of all ages, by the way, are of this recurring nature, right? Like, we want to understand, who are the Palestinians? What are their claims to the land? We want to understand, what's the conflict really about? How do we, right? These are not totally new questions. It's not to say they don't need to be updated, but I think to get a grounding in the conflict, in about a month, you can do that. Now, the challenge is that I think it needs to be an ongoing conversation, because I think within a week it's going to be stale. And so part of this is around giving educators the space to continue to come together, to talk about how they think, to ask their questions. And they don't have to be super long conversations. They can be communities of practice that allow them to come together with people with a similar language and think about, well, how would we bring this to our learners? And educators they're great. Educators are resilient, they are smart, they care deeply. They may not know the answers, and part of it is also giving them a comfort to say, I don't know, I'll look into it. By the way, I love when I get a question that I have to say, I'll come back to you tomorrow. Right? And that's okay. But I think that the frameworks for thinking about the conflict and actually being proactive actually addresses a lot of the sort of worries about things popping out of nowhere. Like if you're proactively creating the space, it's probably not going to pop out of nowhere. And that can be addressed for the educators. Now, where's the system? I think were you going to jump in on this or different?
I'm just thinking that we need to do this in a spiral fashion from very young ages. I mean, this is a real overhaul of how we teach Israel, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we show the map at 7, it should be the map. And when we talk about who lives in Israel, we should talk about them. And we need to talk about identity and nationalism and connection to land and all the people. We are destined to live together. My hope, what's that?
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, my hope is that it's peaceful, right? But we are destined to live together. We're not going anywhere. And so part of it is just trying to understand what that means.
Before you get to the system, I'm just curious, I've listened to all of the conversations you've had about this research, and I'm deep in thought about, our foundation's role, other funders' roles. I'm wondering, are you getting negative pushback? Are there people who are saying, Dr. Fraiman, this just isn't the direction we need to be going? Is there another voice pushing against you?
I mean, I think that not directly, in the sense that I haven't gotten phone calls that say, no, we really shouldn't be talking about this. And yet I don't think we're talking about it. Right. And so I think that this is where the theory and the practice are different. And in some cases I've heard, well, you just need to come and have this conversation with us. And I'm like, that's great. But there's 365 days in a year. And so part of this is also around I think that trust issue, which is how do we trust educators who, let's say, don't have doctorates in international security to have these conversations and to believe that if it's a little messy, it's okay. Because it's going to be messy. And to me, that's the educator confidence part, right? I can get competence, but the confidence comes from saying, my hand is on your back. And in a certain way, it's sort of like the opposite of the gotcha, right? Educators are worried about the gotcha. Oh, you said something, I got a phone call, this is terrible. But I want to suggest, what if we did the opposite? What if, escape room style, we celebrated every small victory? You had a conversation about the conflict, way to go. Way to be brave, way to be in that space. We're going to elevate and lift you up and celebrate that you had a messy conversation. It's a totally different framework and a mindset. And I think that we have to trust our learners to care. By the way, before October 7th, the big fear was that North American Jews wouldn't care, right? That they would be disconnected from Israel. Now you could easily say that there are not young North American Jews who are not sort of connected to Israel. And I would say that doesn't mean they have a relationship with Israel, but they recognize that their American Judaism is deeply connected and intertwined with what's happening in Israel and specifically the conflict. And so now the question is, what do we do with that? Right. And it's not clear where it's going to land when the dust settles. And so I think part of this is making sure that we're ahead of that and thinking this has been a really painful period for global Jewry. What that will mean for the relationship with Israel is still indeterminate. It's not determined yet. We don't know. And I think these conversations give us the space to yes and it, to have a deep relationship with Israel because we care deeply and we recognize and stare in the face all the hard parts.
Yeah, I just want to put a pin in the point that you made, which is there seems to be some general agreement around this very valuable and specific research that really puts a name to what a lot of us were feeling, which good research often does. And that there's not a constant phone, ringing off the hook to say, all right, let's go out, help us do it. There is this reticence to actually do it. And I think there's a good amount of, this is great. I look forward to other people doing it and telling me how it works so I can do it, right? Because I don't want to be the one to jump into this pool first, because stakeholders are anxious about it.
Yeah.
So how do we slowly bring kind of best practices and communities of practice into this conversation who are willing to really go there? Or are they there, or we just have to elevate their work?
Yes, I think there's some glimmers of hope. And by the way, I think there are some institutions that are doing this really well. And from there, I learned what institutional support looks like. For example, I had an educator who told me, my head of school said, if I get a phone call, they'll take it. That simple little act, she acknowledged that there would be phone calls. That's okay. She's not worried about them. The head of school will take it. It's such a small act, but it gave this educator wings to fly in the space. So one is I want to suggest that like some of the interventions are funding, some of the interventions are sort of attitudinal. And I think some of it is also about, these I studied educators and education because that was sort of the area that I was exploring. But I think the lack of conversations around these issues is more systemic. And sometimes we're talking about having the conversation like right now.
Right.
And actually part of what lowers anxiety is to have the conversation and to realize that the world didn't end, that I could still be friends with the person across the table from me who disagreed with me. And I know that we always think about that horrible Thanksgiving conversation where then everybody stomps out and slams the door. But in my experience, and now I've been in the space a really long time, I've rarely had those kinds of conversations. When we set the stage right, most of the conversations don't end with slamming the door. When they're well facilitated. And so for me, part of the systemic intervention is, can we create more spaces for parents to have these conversations, for heads of schools to have these conversations, for funders to have the conversations? It can be behind closed doors, that's okay. But to really disagree, to talk about the anxieties, but actually to talk about the issues, right? And to have that sense that it's okay, right? Like once they've had the conversation, by the way, once educators have the conversation, they'll take it back to their learners. I think the same is true for how many spaces do heads of school have to really talk about their own mixed emotions about Israel right now? I'm
Do
sure
they have those spaces?
I don't think so. I mean, at least I don't know, right? I mean, I'm not invited into closed-door head of school spaces, but I don't get the sense from looking at conference agendas that this is the top of the list.
Well, I've been at several massive gatherings, of wonderful gatherings of Jewish professionals and of different interests. And well, Israel is very much on the minds of everyone. And there is sort of holy space created to stand with Israel. There is not space created for these conversations. And I see in the chat that people are talking about, that curricula and programs are out there for teachers, but that's a very different offering than, okay, funders, parents, heads of school, let's have this conversation. So how do we open those doors? And I'm going to ask specifically, because I'm assuming I don't have the names in front of me, that there are funders on this call. What does it look like if you could, wave the magic funding wand? Where would you put funds to make this happen? And I'm not talking about curriculum to teach how to do this, because I think those do exist. And you just said I can do it in 3 weeks, and I feel like a lot of us have been through those trainings. It's that moving out those circles. Where do you fund and what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I'll say is I think the first thing is just recognizing that the system has these concentric circles. And so any intervention that is supporting educators should include support for head of schools and board chairs. Right? For example, in that 3 week,
Together?
yeah,
Talking
I think together, maybe separately. By the way, I think that sometimes there were examples in my research of board chairs that pulled programming that professionals had done. Now, I think that may have crossed some, board professional lines, but nevertheless, I think these things happen.
And I think that's not uncommon, Keren.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the first thing is we need to create a space where heads of schools and their board chairs get on the same page around what the values are, even just clarifying, like I said earlier, what are the boundaries? What are the values? If there are things that can't be spoken about, let's put them on the table. I might personally disagree with what those boundaries are, but then let's talk about what happens when a child brings that into the classroom, right? And let's be on the same page so that we're marching 2 by 2 into whatever space we're entering. And then I think this is a leadership training it's not a content training, right? And it includes content. It requires sort of a true space where leadership can come together and talk about their anxieties. And sometimes I think even though the research is out there, and there's research that suggests that when teens engage with this information, it does not change their politics, it does not change their love of Israel. I don't know. I don't think that I think research often sits on shelves and people don't necessarily read the research. As I often joke, both people that read my dissertation really loved it. And so I think that, I think in this case, like, how do we begin to let board chairs know that, and the head of school, that they have each other's back, right? And I think related, it's how do we then create conversations to either bring parents along or to bring the content to the parents. By the way, parents are scared of this content too. I recently did an initiative in Miami where we did teen training, teen content, teen learning. And the next morning I had the parents for 2 hours. It was the most valuable 2 hours, more than the teen education was fun. It reminded me why I didn't necessarily always want to teach teens. And also, but the parents, right? They were trying to figure out how to integrate this new reality into their worldview. They had now had new tools to talk to their kids. And so I think that that's like recognizing that the system is so diverse, I think forces us to think about all the different layers. And some of it is not content training, it's really leadership training around these bigger issues. And also creating the space where we say it's not just about a vision of Israel education, it's explicitly saying, and where will the conflict live here, right? And what happens when it gets messy? And what are our boundaries? And what are our goals? And what happens when we have a big argument? But it's also, how do we then hold the community through that disagreement? Because I think one of the big fears is that, like, if kids disagree about Talmud, it's fine, right? Like, we don't worry that it's going to like get onto the playground. But I think we don't say it, but I think we have this fear that if kids or the community disagrees about Israel, that's what will fracture the whole system. And that's the fear that I think is really, because it's not about just the classroom, it's what will happen when these views are revealed. Will they be able to continue to be able to play or to, be friends with one another? Will this really rupture the synagogue or whatever, the camp space beyond lesson?
And what will it mean for our own, for our own donors and our own, financial structure if individuals leave over even these conversations, which is a hard thing to talk about.
Yeah.
And I think, I think you're coming in through the schools, but obviously this is a much bigger conversation than what we're teaching in schools. So how do you feel about the future of Israel education? If maybe this is research that's getting a little more traction than perhaps your dissertation, what would the ripple effect be of your research, and how would that, 5 years from now, if the system was able to really change, what will it look like?
I mean, I think that the first thing is that I think that my fear, and I think we're seeing this now, is that when young Jews get to college or into other spaces and they experience these things for the first time, they lose faith not only in Israel, but they lose faith in our institutions. What else did you lie to me about? What else didn't you tell me? Is this system something that I want to be a part of? I view this as a bit like sex ed, but also like a friend of mine recently shared, like the Talmud's sort of assertion that we need to teach our kids to learn to swim, right? That we need to teach our kids to learn to swim in these rough waters. And we may wish that they were placid, and we may wish that but if we don't teach them how to swim, they will not always float, right? And so to me, like, what comes on the other end? I think it's leaning in to the messiness, and from a very early stage, bringing up not the easy parts of the conflict. And there are, by the way, I think some easier parts of the conflict that don't challenge our morality. And so I think really leaning into these bigger questions and supporting educators. And I think educators are brave, right? Like, I always like to end with gratitude around educators because they are doing really holy work. But what do I think? What do I see in 5 years? Educators that are soaring, that are willing to make mistakes, that are willing to fail forward, that are willing to take chances, and teens that are not going to leave with answers, but teens that are going to leave with questions and deep engagement and connection. By the way, in my graduate course, I often ask my students to find an NGO that represents their own kind of interest or worldviews in Israel, because I believe that the tent is really wide. In Israeli society is a really dynamic, robust democracy that allows for lots of diversity, and we can see ourselves there. And when we can see ourselves there, that creates real relationship in its messiness. And so for me, like, what do I see in 5 years? A totally different conversation. By the way, it's not exclusively conflict education. We should still talk about high tech, and we should still talk about geography, and we should still talk about the Bible, and we should still talk about, music and arts and culture.
I'm all
and
for the
all
Bible. I just want to say I'm all for
the
talking about
Bible. I like, not my jam, but like the Bible, right? But we should still talk about Torah. It's great. And this is part of the conversation, and not an add-on, and not an afterthought, and not when it spikes, but all the time, right? As part of a complicated place that we deeply love, right? And that's what I think can be different, but it does require, I think, building up the confidence, the spaces, but importantly, the system. You can train educators until tomorrow. If the system doesn't not just permit, but embrace and support and elevate this work, it's not the hill they'll die on. It's just not worth it. And I understand them. I am very empathetic to saying, if I'm going to lose my job over a petty disagreement, okay, there's lots of other things to talk about.
Right. A couple of things. One is, I think you're talking about a serious adaptive challenge, that there is no easy technical solution. We can't just hand people curricula and say, okay, here's your conflict curricula, because of all the ripples that go out from it. And I think you're drawing a really important distinction between deep education, deep, enduring, and sustained educational curricula, and hasbara, which I've just heard so much of, what can we give our kids tomorrow when they walk onto campus? What little booklet, what little, tidbit, what TikToks or Instas can we use to combat what they're seeing? And I'm not minimizing the importance of perhaps doing that as well. It's definitely not my expertise, but we have to take a real long view of this. And we also, I think, have to avoid it bubbles up really quickly during the heat of battle, right? And then suddenly we all run in, we got to fix this. And which is how we manage problems, right? When they blow up, that's when we want to go to the doctor. So like all good health systems, we want to do preventative care. So you've talked about the courage of educators, and I agree with you. They're heroes. What message do you have for them, and what message do you have for those investing in this work? And then we'll take a look at some of the questions.
Right. What are my messages to the educators? Just deep gratitude. You have held our learners, and I want to say learners because it's not just kids, right? They're young adults, and they're through a period that is immensely painful for the Jewish people. And whether you've been prepared or not, these conversations have come into your spaces. And so thank you for holding them, right? Because that's part of education. And thank you for trying to help them navigate. We could do more, but even just holding young learners in this moment is really hard. And the fact that there are kids who are joyfully Jewish still, and they are enjoying many of the other aspects of their Jewish lives, that's great, right? And I think that's great for the bigger picture. This is looking at a very small thing, but it's in the context of a much bigger educational agenda. And for those investing, I think there are no quick fixes. It's like you said, it's an adaptive problem, and it's not a quick fix for educators, right? So even with my 3-week or month-long, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about what that might look like. I think that the reality is that this needs to be ongoing. This needs to be part of, continuing education for educators, and, explicit and intentional spaces that allow them to go to the places that are hard to go to. And that needs to be a place that they know exists, and it doesn't exist just when it pops up. I sometimes say that we used to hold our breath through the conflict,
Right. Right.
To be in May and August, we used to hold our breath and then we didn't have to talk about it. We can't hold our breath and we won't hold our breath when it's done. We shouldn't say, oh, now it's over, let's move on. And so one is like, this investment needs to be sustained and it needs to be broad reaching, right? Because these conversations are coming into day camps and overnight camps and into youth groups and into supplementary schools and into day schools. And day schools have the luxury of time, but if you only have an hour, you should know how to use it, right? In a supplementary school. And that's where most of our Jewish kids are,
Right.
right? So,
Right.
we need to think really broadly about who needs the support. But I think the other piece is, I think I want funders to have the conversation themselves, right? Like I want, within whatever space it is, for funders to think about, are the red lines maybe that we used to set, are they still appropriate? Are they harming more than helping? Right? Are we ourselves open to having conversations across difference? And once we are, we might see that it's okay. And are our theories of change actually aligning with that? I think the notion of these red lines was like, well, if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't happen. Well, I can tell you they're learning about it on the playground, and the playground is far nastier than inside of our institutions.
Mhm.
And so at least in our institutions, when they skid their knee, we can hold them and we can tape it up and we can help them fix it. But outside, they're just dealing with it on their own. And so maybe our red lines or our hasbara shown that it didn't work, right? I would argue it hasn't worked, and maybe it's time for a new paradigm. And I think if the funders came together and said, we know this is messy, and we know that there are going to be hard feelings, and we know that then other people will believe they can do it. That's the hand that the funders can do. They can put the hand on the back of the individuals and the institutions that they fund and say, we've got your back. We will not pull our funding if the conversation gets messy. We will help you to bring people along, and that's the leadership skills. And we will enable young learners to have what they need so that when they go off and become young adults, that this is not the first time that they've encountered some of the extremely hard realities that Israel is.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. I just want to double click on, we have to do the things that are hard to do, which is sort of the bottom line here. This is not easy. And it's actually harder. It's going to be harder in the long run if we don't do it.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. The risks, I think we think this is like a type 1, type 2 error kind of situation. I think we think if we talk about it, it can affect their love or whatever it is that we fear, whatever that boogeyman is. But we often don't think about, well, what's the harm when we don't? And I think we're seeing that. So to me, there's a bigger risk in not doing it. And maybe that's why I lean into the conversation before. Because I think when we don't do it, the risks are bigger.
Which was very clear from your research and was one of the most illuminating pieces for me. So we're going to take a few questions. One is ask, what are you mentioned there, we should teach the easier parts of the conflict that don't challenge our morality, which is not a light question. And I don't know if you have an easy answer, but if you can provide an example or two.
Yeah, I mean, and this is actually a hard question to answer, but I'm going to put it out there. I think that the return of the hostages is something that feels very clear, right? We want our hostages home. And I think today I am holding Idan Alexander and his family in my heart. And it feels so good and it feels so bad that so many are still there, including, the hostage that he was with for the entire time. And so, but I think what's interesting about, so I think the schools came around this notion of the release of the hostages, but I spoke with an educator who, and I'll give a little example why there are spaces that I think are easier and harder. That I think was an easier space. And it was something that also the Jewish community was united about. By the way, not in Israel all the time, interestingly enough, but at least in the United States, like the Jewish community was united around returning the hostages. I think what's educationally complicated about that is that I had an educator who told me that they did the activity where they wrote the hostages' names and they tied them to a tree. It felt like a way to engage with the realities of what was happening in the conflict. Except that when bodies started coming home, one of their learners said, "That was my hostage." Right? And then she didn't know what to do. right? Because when they wrote the name, it felt so hopeful. But when he came home, the conversation in the classroom was different. And as adults, I think we all knew that that was part of what was going to happen. But for the kids who just wrote the name on the tree and tied it, in that moment, it was so innocent. But it's not. It's still part of this broader context and this broader conflict. And we will, and this kid now is carrying that story. And on the one hand, I think memory is important, and I think remembering each of the hostages and the victim is important, but it's a different, it's not the whole, it's not the only part of the story.
Someone's asking about, they're both an educator and a local school board member. I don't know if that means secular school or Jewish school, which are very different questions. But let's address the Jewish school board members, you know, the volunteer leaders who, bless them, who really like, you know, just do so much great work for our schools. What can they do? Do they raise this with their head of school? Do they have a board retreat? Do they, you know, board meetings get taken up, we know, by budgets and, you know, cost of, I was going to say pencils, but I don't know if school kids use
Do
pencils.
they use pencils anymore?
I don't know. I do.
I love pencils.
So, you know, what is the average, you know, day school parent, school board member caring, wants to get it right? Where do they start?
So I think one is like agendas are really good places to see board priorities. And so I think we could do a whole study on board agendas and seeing what's important, and budget's
There
important.
you go. You got your next project.
There you go, exactly. And conference schedules, right? And so I think the first thing is it should be a part of the board agenda to think about what is the vision for Israel education and what is the role of conflict education within that vision. And I think that that is a board level agenda. And I think that talking about the edges of that and how we support educators, and I mean investing in professional development, making sure that part of the budget includes professional development around Israel education, knowing that it is different than math, by the way, and that may require additional investment, especially in this moment, and making sure that your budget does reflect that, but also that it's part of the conversation. But the other thing that I would say is, at least at Spertus, our board meetings always include some learning. And so I think there is an opportunity to say we need either a board retreat or even part of our board meeting to include learning or a conversation about Israel. I think there's more diversity in those boardrooms than we often admit, but we don't talk about it. It's not polite to talk about our differences around Israel. But what if our cultural shift was to create a space where we could actually have the conversation, not about the conversation, but the conversation, not because we're going to resolve it, but because it's important to practice, to have the practice of having those uncomfortable conversations, and having the chance for each of us to process where we are and what we think, and also to reckon with differences within our board. And that will also help to understand where the pressures might be coming from. Right. And that's maybe I'd say not an easy step, but it's a step.
I'm watching the clock, so I know we need to wind down, but as you were speaking, a relatively easy step would be for board members to read your article. And I'm not just promoting the article, it's worth promoting, but it's a manageable read. It's not overly long, and ask, what's your reaction to this? Where do we fit into this conversation, so that at least there's a place to start without, I hope, you know, discomfort that is not productive. So I would just invite everyone who's on this call to bring it to their day schools, or to their Hello boards, or to, I mean, it applies to their camp boards. I mean, I know it's written for schools, but I'm quite confident it applies to all of
It included camp educators, actually.
Okay,
So it
great.
the range of educators,
Great.
included them too.
Yeah. So I want to just thank you for your great work, and turn it back to Beth to close.
And thank you, Elka. It's been great.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much. I'm gonna add myself here. Hi. Thank you all so much for this conversation. It, I think, was really illuminating, and I want to say, I'm saying illuminating because I want to acknowledge the challenge and the messiness and the courage that it takes to step into the challenge of these conversations and how that exists in the classroom and in the boardroom and in the head of school's office and in the conversations that that funders and foundations are having about their own allocations. So thank you for helping us think about how to be a bit more courageous and tenacious and resilient in our own engagement and how we think about supporting these kinds of challenging conversations in our own work and our own communities. So thank you so much, Keren and Elka. It was really an honor to get to join you and to listen in on this conversation. As we close out, I just want to share JFN's upcoming events calendar and invite those of you. This is one of our occasional open programs that did not require JFN membership or eligibility to join, and we're very pleased that we were able to offer this to the broader community. Many of these other upcoming programs are limited to JFN members and those eligible for membership, but we do want you to know that we have a program on the 15th for Jewish Foundation professionals in conjunction with Keren that is going to be a panel on what have we learned about Jewish grant making. That's this Thursday. And also this Thursday is the monthly session of our Canadian Funders Peer Network. On the 21st next week, we have the first session of an 8-part series we're launching on pro-democracy philanthropy. And on the 22nd, JFN and Canvas, our Jewish Arts and Culture Peer Network and Funding Collaborative, are also hosting a funder briefing on anti-Semitism in the arts and culture space. And those of you who are new to JFN or want a refresher are welcome to join us, on June 11th for a member orientation. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.